New possibilities for African instruments, constructed by using granular synthesis together with musique concrete principles, except for NPFAI5 and partly in NPFAI4.
In NPFAI.1, why is the need to reconstruct the sound of the instruments?
At first, I was faced with an enormous amount of grain samples, 17,343 to be exact, shorter than 1/10 of a second and longer than 10 milliseconds, including part of the audio frequency range and part of the infrasonic frequency range, which is below 20 Hz. (11,749) in total grain samples were used in the composition. Recombining these grains of sonic quanta in a specific way was possible to rearrange the timbre.
What do you mean when you say, in a specific way?
Well, you need to create a comprehensive sample library system which helps one in the selection process of the samples. This was done manually at first. A few years later, I used the computer as an assistant composer. The computer was instructed to select and analyze the data information and then select with a few hiccups at first. To go back to your original question, in constructing the work was to create extensive percussive sounds, complemented by organic environments, whilst using the sounds of each of the two instruments so that their acoustic physiology could comfortably stand alongside the electronic sound processing generated by the computer. The natures of percussive sounds and organic environments created were from frequencies generated by the decomposition of the original sound source in the process of obtaining continuous sounds out of discontinued ones, as there is a logarithmic relationship between the increase in density and perception. The sound field you just heard consists of 15 processed layers, each layer varying slightly in magnitude. Each layer was individually manipulated until a point of change was noticed between the finger piano imbira and the bowed harp kundi, thus increasing the magnitude of the sound field 225 times in total. However, the way the final result is perceived is a change of 1. Working with each individual layer gave me a better control in the change of sound characteristics, as some sound phenomena changed, disappeared, as new sounds surfaced, creating new possibilities.
Having listened on many occasions to NPFAI.1, it becomes apparent that sound seems to be a go-between. Music is a different thing.
Completely attached to the way sound lives in NPFAI.1. The way I constructed the composition aims at the timbre and structure of the sound envelope. Music never begins nor finishes with sound. It's the transcendence of the object by means of pure intuition.
What is the driving force between your creative thinking and applying this to music?
The concept of music in my musical evolution in itself was abstracted. Any natural models or matter were all is only to become. I thought about the idea of how music became, how did it evolve, what is the validity and authenticity of one's work. How can we free ourselves from the false? Listening to an acoustic phenomenon, I want to surprise its natural direction, its tendencies, the sense of its sonic matter. The intuition needs to liberate itself from factitious things. You have to leave it to operate in its original purity. So you need to enter an absolute game where there is no comparative. Nothing is purer, more real, more alive. I finally came to the conclusion that the means of music creation in primal cultures went through similar difficulties as we are faced with electronic music. Constantly learning how to operate new devices in creating music which is challenging, different and unique. Since the creation of contemporary electronic music, electroacoustic music, and its infiltration over a number of years into the commercial media, the relationship between that which is primal and that which is contemporary is a pragmatic phenomenon and establishes a bridge of communication. By communication, I mean a system by which encoding and decoding takes place as a means by which information processing devices affect and are affected by the other. The configuration maps a set of signals onto a set of significates, or call it meanings. It establishes a link between primal and modern culture. As primal culture is constantly seeking to evolve, the modern composer is in constant search within the sport. Whilst connecting to the vibrations, ideas generated from literatures in order to establish originality and purity.
NPFAI-3 was the original electronic composition used also in the electro-acoustic NPFAI.3 and WM. Years later we had NPFAI 3.1.
African music consists of complex rhythmic patterns. The most common polyrhythm plays 3 beats on top of 2, like a triplet, played against straight notes, often involving one rhythm played against another to create a polyrhythm. The call and response nature of the rhythm, where one drum will play a rhythmic pattern, echoed by another drum playing the same pattern. A call rhythmic pattern is typically played with the drummers, then improvising new patterns over the static original patterns. In the latter part of the year 2018, I began to work on the construction of NPFAI 3.1. I was reading an article on ceremonial music, the funeral music performed by the Lodaga community of Ghana. Intertwining rhythmical interaction produced patterns of communicative repetition. I created rhythmical patterns by using the xylophone and the mbira, together with the distortive elements in real life, reflects upon the emotional suffering of those left behind in the announcement of death.
Did you apply granular synthesis?
Granular and modulation syntheses were used in NPFAI 3.1. Granular, algorithmic and subtractive sound syntheses were used in NPFAI 3.
How was the computer work constructed?
NPFAI 3, the instrument was played with traditional mallets. The work was allowed to explore electroacoustic techniques in a similar way as the return to archaic origins of African music through the Jungian search of archetypes. An inherited pattern of thought or symbolic imagery derived from the past collective experience and present in the individual unconscious. The 5-octave Western marimba was used with prepared mallets, objects, hands, vocal clicking, sounds and gestures with the electronic environment. This section is called NPFAI3 plus WM, meaning Western marimba. Very different instrument to the African marimba, and one of the most distinctive features missing, besides the different wood used for the keys, are different resonators and the absence of buzzers.
The familiarization of the two instruments. Was it a concern?
The aim of the exercise was not to defamiliarize the sound of the instrument, but rather to explore the deeper analogies of organic identity in the construction of microsound environments, focusing on capturing the physical properties of the instrument and its organic sound textures. The rhythmical content of such microenvironments were developed to create an interplay with the source of the recorded material. It is clear that energy sets motion to occur by creating vibrations at molecular level, such as understanding allowed for the creation of tension build-up zones and fragility in the sound. Fragility is directly related to the density and pressure build-up, and at a given time allowing for explosive and implosive moments to occur. The different degrees of implosive status of sound energy are subharmonic in nature and are felt rather than heard. The different degrees in the explosive nature of sound energy are extended to the left and right speakers in the stereo setup. In NFPI3 for Western marimba, I extended my observations of motion into an interlocuting visual and audio performance. The sounds generated on the marimba would interlock with the electronic environment in such a way that the listener would struggle to distinguish the nature of the sound source. The experience has a deeper philosophical meaning, signifying the occultation of a source, thus rendering it inaccessible to profanity.
Can you explain how you go about using acousmatics?
The acousmatic is the highest diagonal science of sound material, the purest degree, the most solitary adventure of listening. Elevating the sound, the virgin sense of human thought, to the highest degree of abstraction. Acousmatic, which comes from the Socratics, refers to the art of science to disguise the source of sound with the purpose of making it more precious, penetrating and more unrecognizable, richer. The acousmatic is about concealing the process of emission of sound using instrumental techniques other than the established ones. It has to do with sound produced, unheard of, thus finding oneself in a borderline of situations. The spiritualization of music, it is unpredictable, dissecting the nucleus of the sound. In the NPFI series, the idea was to the process of the cosmetics to reach a level of textural and environmental order in the sound where interlocking possibilities would be accomplished, creating unusual interplay by the instrumentalist, where it would be difficult to separate the prepared sound and that which is performed, thus finding the listener and the performance in borderline situations.
NPFAI.5. This is the computer composition. Why the need to divert from traditional instruments?
The neo-traditional computer composition, NPFAI5, was created not from audio samples as used in your Z concrete, but by purely electronic techniques. It is more challenging and rewarding in contemporary computer music to create sounds from scratch. The sounds originating in this work were inspired by two traditional instruments used by the Khoisan, for example, the Xali, the Xongsoro, a mouth friction bow used by the Zunsan people, and the Diklaka reed pipes with tetratronic tuning was derived from the Khoi. The work was created electronically along the lines of aesthetic conception. The combination of electroacoustic music and my observations on African motion was a means of conveying the spirit of tradition. The computer was used also as an assistant composer in this work. Following two new program steps, the composition benefited from synthesized sound modules, contrasting between that which is artificial and that which followed organic constructive procedures, created with clarity between artificial and organic environments. Step 1 and 2 was discussed in a 4-page article named NPFAI 5 in construction, and step 3 was discussed fully in Lexicophony 1, computer generated composition, published in the Journal of the Musical Arts in Africa, volume 13 of 2016.
I understand as organic you mean smooth and accessible sound.
To construct using organic terminology, I draw conceptually on biological sciences. I use principles such as biological mechanisms as a foundation in composing.
At what search point do you begin the construction of music?
Dissecting the sound is exposed to gravitational forces as well as forces of cohesion and nuclear attraction. As one approaches the central core of the sound, one begins to expose properties as vibrations. Dislocating these vibrations gives birth to energy comparable to that of particles, a raw purity. These are laws of physics that one needs to follow. The raw purity, a type of primordial sound, is what I aim to reach. This stage of accessibility is beyond what we identify as musical structure. I apply this principle to the instruments used and to the environments in the NPFI series. For the last 13 years, I have been constructing and composing from data, information derived from site-specific projects, to analyze and compose. Data assists me to determine behavioral, mobility, transcendence, and development patterns of both organic and inorganic environments.
The instrument Shigo VR, as mentioned in NPFAI.4, is a flute-like instrument. How does it differ from a conventional flute?
Singovia is a globular flute, a wind instrument which occupies organological and executive characteristics. A primary role is the musical patrimony in Gaza, region of Mozambique. This tubular flute is used by the Chopi people. Singovia are vessel flutes. They can be any shape but still have finger holes and a blowhole, and are generally played in the same fashion as a tubular flute, but that's where the similarity ends. The physics of sound production is significantly different between the tubular and globular instruments. In globular instruments, the shape of the air contained within the vessel is generally irrelevant to the pitch. It's the total volume of air contained in the vessel and the size of the opening that determines the pitch. The system at play here is commonly called a Helmholtz resonator. The size of the tone hole of globular flutes has a similar effect, but the location of the tone hole has essentially no effect on the pitch. The pitch range is limited and it is not possible to play overtones on a globular instrument. Singovias have a range of less than an octave plus a third.
Why the use of a ring modulator?
The use of a ring modulator modulates the amplitude of the input signal with the carrier signal producing and output new frequencies, which are the sum and difference of the input and the carrier signals. Since globular flutes are not designed to produce overtones, exposing the instrument to ring modulation helped me to obtain these new frequencies.
NPFAI.4 used two globular flautists with the electronic score.
I focused on blending the aesthetic with the acoustic, looking for new ways to expand traditional instrument systems. Audio recordings were obtained from the Instituto de Comunicação in Mozambique during field research in 2006, and the instruments were acquired with the advice from local Chopi musicians. With an audio recorder, I captured a variety of audio environments in the Gaza region, both natural and contrasting. NPFAI-4 is constructed around the engagement of two traditional Chopi musicians playing Singovia, whilst I constructed the electronics in the work. The field recordings are used as a guide to create artificial environments. My aim was to produce a work of pseudo-natural origin, gradually introducing electronics which slowly take over, engulfing certain natural elements in the environment, resulting in a futuristic battleground of natural and artificial synthesized flute sounds, transforming the local pseudo-environment into a synthetic minefield.
As a method of communication in Africa, a message can be transmitted over vast distances with the use of talking drum in Western and Eastern Africa.
Conversation on human speech into equivalent sounds for transmission in signaling systems encompasses a wide variety of techniques by which the signals are produced, including whistling, syllabic substitution, and a wealth of instrumental replication. Music resembles language in the sense that it is a temporal sequence of articulated sounds that are more than just sounds. The succession of sounds is like logic. It can either be right or wrong, but music does contain things that come very close to the primitive concepts found in epistemology. It makes use of recurring ciphers. These were established by tonality to create lexical items. The authenticity of association of music and language could further be transformed into an internationally accepted coded text or system. In NPFAI 6, also referred to as signaling, the African xylophone and the whistle through computer-assisted processing tend to develop a language of communication. In other words, the beats originating from the xylophone and the electroacoustic environment are represented as dots. The whistle and all other atmospheric sounds are represented as a dash, concentrating on free form of language. The contemporary elements used in the composition begins by extracting rhythmic structural information, rearranging them into encoded signals based along communication principles. The construction of communication between three instruments, the African xylophone, whistle, and the computer. Using the International Morse code system to decode the variety of signals embedded in the composition allows for a transformative communication to occur between composer, performer, narrator, and audience.
Taxidermy, Maputo, February 2006, traveling around the city discovering places of memory, body and space scars, searching all these places, not able to manage the past, the future, the flaws of the city. Explain the transformation of structure.
These are points of departure, strategies of anthropologic analysis by which a city gives its own unique identity. Areas of communication are pre-linguistic by nature, beginning at the point where memory fails and rooted in our subconscious as the communication force transcends time, giving order and meaning to the past, the now and the indefinite future. It is here where questions, tangibility of what is reality begins to make sense, where animate and inanimate objects interdepend on each other and are merely reflections of the self. This choreographic work was staged by the French dance company Project In Situ, and the whole work was created in Maputo through the Franco-Mozambican Cultural Center and the Institut Français in South Africa. So the whole crew consisted of a choreographer and an anthropologist, Martin Chaput, and Martial Chazalon, and lighting was conducted by Cyril Givort from France, and the dance company of Panaibra Gabriel from Mozambique, scenographer a Zimbabwean Barry Bickle. The music was composed by me.
Why are there two titles, Gesticular and Taxidermy?
Project Institute selected 5 scenes from the work to be used in taxidermy. The analysis and interrelationships between gesture and kinetic motion, I felt that the Portuguese title Gesticular, meaning gesture, was a stronger title to represent the audio section of the composition.
Gesticular was composed for traditional, conventional instruments and computer. Why?
Yes, contrabass, grand piano, violin, African xylophone, mbira, field recordings were used. The aim was to embody the history of the city through colonialism, Marxism, and the present. Thus, the variety of instruments were appropriate.
Achieving or creating a dialogue between spaces, how did the music and the dances interact?
Placing the relationship of artists to the urban environment at the center of a creation process is to ask the question of place, space, context, representation in the city that welcomes us. The question reappears when the show is presented elsewhere, far away, sometimes very far from context and the issues that gave birth to it. How to put it into play elsewhere, a process intermittently linked to a place. In Marseille and Lyon, taxidermy enters a second stage of creation, which is based on a dialogue between the cities and Maputo. The visual aspect needed to change to accommodate the performance in other cities. As hearing is different, sound is not limited to boundaries. The audio work was a unique universal purity. It does not need change.
How do you portray expression to inner self relating to history and memory, since these dimensions are individually unique to one?
The speed of movement, force and weight. With the keyword movement, the context to music should be given, since all sound is a result of moving objects. And the idea of particle physics tells us that those elements like molecules represent a kind of modular system, with molecules as smallest elements being able to be attached to each other. The physical model of the macro, micro, meso elements are interdependent and interrelated to each other, relying on gesture as a need to shape them. Gesture relationships extend through the city, Maputo, and are byproducts of memory. The raw material, the original recordings, has not been replaced by the metaphysical high-end production, going beyond empiricism and the mundane. The work begins where common sense fortunately fails us, as unevenness of the composition allowed the portrayal of Maputo as a city leaning forward and backwards, where the rhythmical cycle of nature is there but is disjointed.